Greetings, Tashidali, and we're going to talk about the crisis at the Third Pole. And to start with, let's go back a few decades to 1989, when His Holiness the Dalai Lama was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. Not so well known, His Holiness has been a staunch defender of the environment for decades. His Nobel Peace Prize was the first ever awarded for an environmental initiative. He in fact advocated for the preservation of Tibetan culture and environment. At the time, he proposed the transformation of Tibet into a biosphere reserve and a zone of peace, a buffer between China and India. And Tibet being twice the size of Western Europe, that would be a giant biosphere reserve, the largest on the planet. Had he been taken up on that initiative, Asia would be in much better shape today. Unfortunately, China has chosen to exploit Tibet heavily with mega dams and mega mining, indulging in ecosystem destruction. This ecosystem destruction has accelerated since the arrival of the railway in Lhasa in 2006. Let's go back much further in time, over a millennium, to the oldest surviving text of written Tibetan from the 9th century AD, which includes this poetic fragment. This center of heaven, this core of the earth, this heart of the world, fenced round with snow, the headland of all rivers, where the mountains are high and the land is pure. This shows the immense pride that Tibetans took in their icy environment. Tibetans, in a sense, developed the world's first national parks, which are actually sanctuaries consecrated by high lamas, where everything must be left untouched. Tibetans safeguarded their lands and their wildlife for thousands of years. They developed the concept of sacred landscape. They developed the concept of interconnectedness. The Jalaka tales detail the 500 previous lives of the Buddha, even when Buddha was an elephant. And even insects were respected, though there were no mosquitoes in Tibet. It was too high for them. But they are coming in now. It's being spotted in Lhasa, unfortunately. Tibetan Buddhism built on the original Bon Animus faith of believing in spirits dwelling in trees, water bodies, and mountaintops. Tibetan Buddhism is more of a code of ethics, a moral compass fostering great respect for nature, for wildlife, all sentient beings. And this is what Tibetan Buddhism brings to the table. Great respect for nature. His Holiness the Dalai Lama identified where problems lie. He says, destruction of nature and natural resources results from ignorance, greed, and lack of respect for the earth's living things. American scientist Gus Speth echoes this, saying, I used to think the top environmental problems were biodiversity loss, ecosystem collapse, and climate change. I thought that with 30 years of good science we could address these problems, but I was wrong. The top environmental problems are selfishness, greed, and apathy, and to deal with those we need a spiritual and cultural transformation. And we scientists don't know how to do that. But Tibetan Buddhism does have solutions because it has developed a system of ethics and beliefs that respect and protect nature, embracing compassion for all sentient beings, and stressing how all life is interconnected. His Holiness the Dalai Lama calls for global action by secular ethics not based on any religion. He says, the reality of the world today is that grounding ethics in religion is no longer adequate. I'm increasingly convinced that the time has come to find a way of thinking about spirituality and ethics beyond religion altogether. The fact is that we need science and ethics to come together to solve the climate crisis. Science by itself can be dangerous. Ethics provides the moral compass. I'm going to briefly sketch out the looming crisis at the Third Pole, looking at the melting glaciers, thawing permafrost, rivers under threat, major deltas sinking and receding, and what all this means for Asia. That's a lot of ground to cover in 15 minutes or so I hope you're still with me at the conclusion. Ethnic Tibet, the pre-1950 version, covered 2.3 million square kilometers, roughly the size of Western Europe. The entire Tibetan Plateau encompasses some 46,000 glaciers. That's approximately a quarter of the global total. So Tibet is a great refrigerator of the planet, along with the other two poles. And it has a host of sacred peaks, starting with Mount Kailash in the far west Tibet, to Namche Bawa in the eastern Tibet, and further east to Mount Kawakapo. In Tibetan, it is known as Gangchen, the land of snows, but these days it should be called, perhaps, the land of melting snows. Outside of the Arctic and Antarctic, the Tibetan Plateau is the largest source of fresh water, which is why it is known as the Third Pole. But unlike the other two poles, Tibet supplies fresh water to people downstream on its extensive river system. The best way to visualize this is H2O, highlands to ocean. Everything in Tibet is monumental in scale. Going from Everest, it's a drop of almost 9,000 meters down to sea level. The average elevation of Tibet is around 4,000 meters. Tibet has the highest mountains on the planet, and its rivers run through the deepest gorges on the planet. Due to climate change and global heating, mostly driven by vast emissions from China and India, the glaciers are melting rapidly. Over the next decades, this will lead to flooding and to unprecedented disasters, such as one in Tibet where the entire glacier collapsed. And then as the glaciers recede, eventually this will lead to a severe lack of water to feed rivers, which will be a major crisis. The melting of glaciers can be slowed down, but solutions seem far away. A major factor contributing to glacial meltdown is the burning of fossil fuels in both China and India. That releases CO2 into the atmosphere, which leads to warming. And it also releases particles of black soot, known as PM 2.5 or PM 10. It is currently thought that up to half of the meltdown can be attributed to black soot. Black soot is not a greenhouse gas, it's particles. And it comes from the burning of fossil fuels. So in theory, if you stop the burning of fossil fuels, there'll be no more black soot. And that would solve two problems: better health for people with cleaner air, and the other problem is the glaciers, because the black soot darkens the glaciers, which attracts the sun, which means faster meltdown. But neither China nor India seem to have the least bit of interest in stopping their coal addiction. Neither nation has indicated a target for coal reduction by 2030. In fact, the use of coal is increasing in both China and India. It's not just the glaciers of Tibet that are melting. Under the surface, the permafrost is thawing. Across Tibet, there's a thick layer of ice under the ground, the third largest region of permafrost on the planet. This layer of ice retains moisture in the crust of the earth, which is essential for grasses and plant life to survive. Without the permafrost, there's definitely more danger of desertification. Grasslands of Tibet constitute an enormous carbon sink, and if the permafrost thaws, it will release methane, a greenhouse gas reckoned to be 80 times more potent than CO2. China's plundering of Tibetan resources is contributing to the rapid degradation of the grasslands. The grasslands is not exactly a natural system. It evolved through millennia of Tibetan nomads grazing the yaks. So in a sense, the yaks are the gardeners of the grasslands, and the Tibetan nomads are the stewards. They need to rotate their livestock to keep the grasslands in good shape. This ancient system has been severely disrupted by Chinese introduction of fencing, and then moving the nomads off their traditional grazing lands altogether and sending the yaks to the slaughterhouses. This policy has been roundly condemned by the UN IPCC and other watchdogs, but China continues with this misguided policy and indulges on top of that in greenwashing by announcing the creation of a large number of national parks and reserves in Tibetan regions, which turn out to be parks on paper only, designed to remove nomads to make way for Chinese mining and megadams. A big factor in the destruction of the grasslands today and desertification is the expansion of mining, Chinese mining. There are over 120 valuable minerals that China wants to get its hands on, including lithium, extracted from lakes in Qinghai and far west Tibet. And there's been deforestation on a massive scale at the edges of the Tibetan Plateau. The original wild grazers of the plateau have been hunted to near extinction levels, including the fabulous animals like the wild yak, the third largest mammal in Asia after the elephant and the rhino. Also threatened is the Tibetan antelope, with the finest underwool in the world, and rising temperatures are sending these species higher in elevation and actually heading towards extinction. Tibet hosts unique high-altitude biodiversity, from the fabulous blue poppy flowering at 4,000 meters to bar-headed geese, which fly over the Himalayas twice a year. Astronauts on the wing, that's the highest migration in the world. So the solutions are stop deforestation, stop mega mining, keep the Tibetan nomads in place to counter loss of grasslands, and stop the advancing desertification. I'd like to take a look at the rivers of Tibet. Tibetan Plateau does something that the two poles cannot do. It supplies fresh water to people, one way or another, up to 2 billion people. So there are 10 major river systems that originate in Tibet, carving rivers through the deepest gorges on the planet. The 500-kilometer long Dialang Sampo Gorge is 3 times deeper than Colorado's Grand Canyon. No glaciers, no rivers. Well, there is monsoon rain, but that is not a constant glacier drip feed. So some rivers sourced in Tibet are heavily glacier dependent, such as the Indus, which flows through Pakistan and India and is the lifeline of Pakistan. Other rivers are less dependent on glaciers. China is building megadams on all the major rivers of Tibet. These are dams that block sediment and fish migration, both essential for agriculture and fisheries downstream. China recently announced that it aims to become carbon neutral by the year 2060, but neglected to mention how this will be achieved, given that China is heavily addicted to coal, supplying over 60% of its power. It seems a significant part of the carbon neutrality will be achieved by building new megadams, and there is only one place to do that. You have to keep in mind that China currently has over 25,000 large dams, which is more than the rest of the world combined. So it's maxed out in China itself. There's only one place you can build new dams, and that's in Tibet. It has a potential of 70 gigawatts of power at the Great Band of Dialang Sampo, for example. To back this up, China is a proponent of the green dam myth, which claims that megadams are renewable and sustainable energy with zero emissions. This is far from the truth. For starters, megadams have significant methane emissions from rotting vegetation that has been flooded by megadam reservoirs, which are massive in size. In addition to boosting the construction of megadams, China plans to hoard and divert water from megadams on a scale that has never been seen in recorded history. This is essentially theft of water, which the downstream nations rely on. The solutions would seem to be obvious: a moratorium on dam building across the Himalayan range, but none of the players are interested in that option. Another way to do this would be preserve river corridors, such as the proposed Kanali River corridor in Nepal. That's the last free-flowing river from Tibet there. And there is a much better solution, which is to find alternate energy sources which are not dams, such as solar power. At the tail end of the mighty rivers from Tibet lie great deltas: the Yangtze River Delta, the Mekong Delta, the Indus Delta, and the largest delta in the world, the Ganges-Brahmaputra Delta. These deltas are dying in the sense that they are slowly sinking due to lack of incoming coarse sediment, sand, and due to rising sea levels. We are facing a global sand crisis. The world is running out of sand because sand cannot be generated fast enough to keep up with the extraction of sand. That is mostly due to rampant dredging of river sand. River sand is the best for making concrete because beach sand is too corrosive and salty, and desert sand is too fine. So the dredging of river sand is going on a massive scale, mostly illegal, operated by the sand mafia in places like China, Cambodia, Vietnam, and many other nations. Along with megadam construction, which blocks the passage of coarse sediment downstream, this all leads to saltwater intrusion, which will kill crops and threaten food and water security in these vast regions. This is already happening along the mighty Mekong River, where Chinese megadam builders have completed 11 major dams. Shawan Dam on the Mekong is the height of the Eiffel Tower from the base up, to give you an idea of scale. This dam is twice the size of Patala Palace for width and height, and its massive reservoir impounds 15 billion cubic meters of water. That's billion with a B. Shawan has an output of 4,200 megawatts, the size of 4 nuclear reactors. And upstream, an even bigger monster, Noisy-le-Dou Dam, at 5,820 megawatts. Between those two dams, they generate 10 gigawatts of power, which is enough to power up a small nation in Europe. These megadams are slowly strangling the river, blocking nutrient-rich silt from reaching Vietnam's Mekong Delta, which leads to sediment starvation, leaving the delta open to saltwater intrusion, which will kill rice crops on which the nation of Vietnam depends, blocking fish migration and spawning, leading to the slow death of the world's largest inland fishery, and particularly Lake Tonle Sap in Cambodia, is another factor. Cambodia's protein comes from fishing in this lake, and that depends on the flood pulse of the Mekong, which is not happening these days. species that are disappearing are the giant catfish and the Mekong dolphin. What is needed here is a moratorium on river sand dredging, which is totally unsustainable, or at least strict regulation of that. Moratorium on building megadams on the rivers of Tibet to keep these rivers free-flowing. Regarding all of the preceding, the melting glaciers, the thawing permafrost, the ecosystem collapse generated, nothing much is being done at global level to address the issues. The United Nations to the rescue, not likely. Tibet is not represented as a nation at any events like UN get-togethers, and China is not about to talk about its rampant exploitation of Tibet. So the third pole continues to head for a disaster of epic proportions, titanic proportions. There are, however, some rays of hope with some great solutions from the Tibetan Buddhist world in the Himalayan region. Ladakh is a shining model. It gets tons of sunshine, high-altitude desert, so there's vast solar potential, which is being utilized in solar farms with gigawatts of power. So Tibet is second only to the Sahara in terms of solar potential, and these solar farms can rival the output of megadams. Another ingenious solution from Ladakh is ice stupas, which replicate the action of glaciers by storing winter ice and slowly releasing water over the summer months for irrigating crops. Behind this idea is Ladakhi engineer Sonam Wanchuk. These ice stupas are expensive to build, cost around $30,000 to build one. And they would never get off the ground without the support of Drigong Kyabgon Chetsang Rinpoche, who rallied monks and volunteers around construction of ice stupas in Piang Valley, for example. Over 50% of Bhutan has been set aside for national parks, wildlife reserves, and wildlife corridors, the only nation in the world that can claim to have done that. Famed American biologist E.O. Wilson introduced the Half-Earth Plan long ago, suggesting that setting aside half the planet would allow for recovery of nature. The way we're going, we'd be very lucky to see a third of the planet set aside for that. The tiny nation of Bhutan claims another great milestone, which is all organic farming, no GM crops, using natural pesticides like yak urine. Bhutanese policy is advised by Dr. Vandana Shiva, India's top environmental activist, who has taken on the likes of Monsanto in India. Monsanto has attempted to patent seeds in India and around the world, and Vandana Shiva rightly says, this is ridiculous. You cannot patent life. Besides which, the pesticides and herbicides used with Monsanto are lethal and cause such phenomenon as bee colony die-offs. Over 70% of Bhutan is forested by in its constitution, and the one area where Bhutan falters is construction of large dams to export hydropower to India. Bhutan has done its part, but other neighbors have not, so Bhutan suffers from indirect fallout, such as the glacial lake outburst floods, which result from glacial meltwater pooling into a lake, which then bursts its banks and can wipe out entire villages in a deluge of mud and water. I'd like to come back to His Holiness the Dalai Lama and his initiatives for environment and education. He says this: environmental education about the consequences of the destruction of our ecosystems and the dramatic decrease in biodiversity must be given top priority, but creating awareness is not sufficient. We must find ways to bring about changes in the way we live. I call on the younger generation, be rebels demanding climate protection and climate justice, because it is your future that is at stake. And His Holiness has introduced the SEE learning curriculum. SEE stands for Social, Emotional, and Ethical Learning, which is the establishment of a long-cherished dream of his to establish a worldwide initiative to educate the heart and mind. Indeed, our survival on this planet may well depend on promoting the values that His Holiness the Dalai Lama holds dear: secular ethics, compassion, world peace, warm-heartedness, universal responsibility, and working together globally. What is desperately needed to tackle the climate crisis is a change of consciousness. Buddhism can lead the way. Namaste.